I'm here representing a network of 14 higher ed institutions. My role currently is to be a steward of the funds and a coordinator of the work across this network. We call ourselves the Network for Excellence in Teaching, and were brought together originally in 2009-10 under the aegis of the Bush Foundation here in Minnesota. And the Bush Foundation funds projects in 3 states, Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And at the time, their effort was to invest in teacher education redesign. And they brought these 14 institutions together, and on the second slide you'll see where those 14 institutions are. We have the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities, and then also in the Twin Cities we have a consortium of private colleges, which includes Augsburg, Bethel, Concordia, Hamlin, St. Thomas, and St. Catherine's. So that consortium has called themselves the TC2 organization, and they've been part of this work. Also in Minnesota, we have 3 state universities in St. Cloud, Mankato, and Winona. And then in the northern part with North Dakota, we have another state university, Moorhead, along with North Dakota State University and Valley City University. And then in South Dakota, the University of South Dakota is a member of this consortium. So we've been working together for about 6 years now, and under the umbrella of being a teacher effectiveness initiative, we've worked on recreating and reimagining how teacher education recruits teachers into becoming teachers, how we prepare them, how we partner with schools in the clinical aspects of the preparation process, how we support them through the hiring process and in their early career, and then moving on into some measurement around how do we know that the teachers who we're preparing are effective in the classrooms, and how do we know that what they're doing what we're doing in preparation programs is supporting their development as effective teachers. Big questions that we always need to keep focused on is, why should we define teacher effectiveness? There's lots of controversy in our world around what it means to be effective or how we should be thinking about effective. But what I'm trying to do here is point out that we have 4 driving purposes right now within our state and across this tri-state region and nationally on why the notion of teacher effectiveness is becoming more and more salient for us. On the one hand, we want to ensure that every student has access to high quality teachers, and quality and effectiveness are 2 ideas that go hand in hand. In Minnesota specifically, we have the Department of Education has created an equity plan that is trying to ensure that this happens, as well as in the Minnesota Teacher Development and Evaluation Law that went into effect a couple of years ago, there's a clause that indicates that students need to have access to high quality teachers, and schools are responsible for that. Another purpose for thinking about effectiveness is that we have individual teacher development that relies on our ability to provide feedback on the quality of instruction as well as the impact of their instruction on students. So in Minnesota, we have a teacher development and evaluation law that has 3 main components: that teachers are observed, that the student engagement is something that is important to understand within classrooms and schools, and that the impact on students is understood by the individual teacher. Now, how that's done is a local system, a local process. We don't have a statewide process for saying that student achievement is measured in particular ways. That's decided at the district level, but there are state guidelines in law that says that individual teachers need to get this feedback on an annual basis and then be summatively evaluated every 3 years on those 3 big pieces. We also have consumer information for choosing teacher education programs that is becoming more of our conversation. And our state did pass a law that says that we have to produce a Minnesota Data Summary Report on teacher education that would give people looking for teacher education programs more information about what happens in those programs or the quality of those programs. And then we have the teacher preparation program improvement purpose. What is it that we need to know from our candidates after they leave us that will then help drive improvement of the preparation experience in the university? And that is regulated through our accreditation process, an organization called the Council for Accreditation of Educator Preparation, and recently new federal regulations that were just released last month that will require states to report on aspects of quality of teacher preparation. So these are all driving forces behind teacher preparation, and our main purpose in this work is around teacher preparation program improvement. The other pieces are important for us, and we want to make sure that we're aligned with all those other statutes and purposes, but our driving purpose is improving the quality of preparations that teachers receive within our consortium and beyond. So when we think about what that looks like, it's a very simple cyclical diagram, but it gets much more complicated when you get down into practice. But the main idea is that we are preparing future teachers in higher education institutions like the next organizations. They go out and become classroom teachers who are now under the evaluation processes of the P-12 school systems. And in those first years of teaching, there's a lot of information that the school systems collect and understand about the quality and effectiveness of the teacher that could be brought back into the higher education arena for continuous program improvement. So, but what looks simple becomes complicated when you ask the questions, what information is actually shared across these two very different kinds of institutions, the higher ed world and the P-12 world, and even more complicated when we ask how is that information to be shared. We don't want this to be a bureaucratic hoop-jumping reporting process, which is kind of how state law can get interpreted sometimes. We want this to be a partnership development between these two worlds of higher education and the P-12 world so that we're jointly invested in the quality of the preparation of teachers as they are part of our higher education programs and as they move into that school system in their beginning years. So it's got to be a partnership in figuring out what this looks like and how we can best engage in it. So we are now considering, after a year of work, engaging stakeholders in the conversation around what is effectiveness and how can we imagine effectiveness as we move forward in trying to create this system, this feedback loop between the two parts of the system. And we're looking at potential measures of quality. So when we ask ourselves what shows us quality of teaching, it's not too hard to get to teaching practices, meaning that we need to understand how teachers plan for instruction, the actual instructional quality, the relationships that they have with students. There's a strong commitment to culturally relevant pedagogy, that the teachers are working with practices that are culturally responsive for the diverse students in their classrooms, and then classroom assessment practices. There's also a piece of quality that comes in the teacher's knowledge. This is a fairly standard way of thinking about what teachers bring into the classroom with them. And here we have preparation program tests as some indication of knowledge, content knowledge tests, pedagogy tests, and grade point averages. None of these are perfect in and of themselves. They are the current measures that we have in our system. For this, we have a performance assessment that has been adopted statewide in Minnesota called the EdTPA. TPA is Teacher Performance Assessment. And in that standardized performance assessment, all teacher candidates produce information about these elements of their practice through video, student work, and their commentaries around that. And in the teacher development and evaluation laws, teachers are also being observed on many of these same elements. So we have some measures in place here. Our next piece of the work is figuring out how does the information about the individual teacher or groups of teachers travel within that system between what we do in higher ed with something like an EdTPA score and assessment and what we know from schools with regard to the teacher development and evaluation practices that are developed locally. We don't have a system for talking to each other with regard to these two different parts of the system and how we measure this aspect of quality. Another aspect of teacher effectiveness is student outcomes. This is probably the hardest, if the metaphor nut to crack, right? Getting inside something called student outcomes is a really challenging task. We can use student achievement scores, but we don't have standardized scores. In the teacher development evaluation law, You use locally developed student measurement growth measures. So those are not something that are collected in an aggregate way across many different schools. So it's a hard thing for us to collect up and understand what that means across a large disparate group of school districts that have each developed their own measure. It's also something that is held in the teacher development aspect as personnel data, meaning that it's not something that is allowed to be released to the public. And so we can ask for aggregate or groups of teachers to have information about the outcome of students, but we don't have access to individual teacher information in the higher ed world. Engagement in the classroom is being done in Minnesota and in the other 2 states in some ways, but again, it's part of the teacher development and evaluation information, so it's not available to be reported outside of the school personnel system. So we need to think about how we can aggregate information in meaningful ways so that that information about student engagement in the early career of teachers' classrooms can travel back into higher education. And then the last potential measure is contributions to the school systems, and these are a little bit easier to gather in terms of hiring rates for newly licensed teachers, retention rates after 3 years in the classroom, and maybe a little bit harder is the engagement with families and communities as some measure of the effectiveness of the teacher. So these are the measures that we're working on and the systems that we're aiming to try to develop together as an institution. And I will just point out, as a consortium of 14 institutions, and I do want to just acknowledge that we have one more member of the team here on the University of Minnesota campus, Sarah Kemper, a graduate student who coordinates the governing council for this consortium, because without coordinating across the institutions, we wouldn't be able to make progress like we are so far in our work together. So thank you, Cheryl, for passing out the materials, and thank you all for participating today.